is a PhD. I said, if you don't have a PhD, nobody's going to take you serious here. So he said, but we can use this project towards your thesis. You got to complete the coursework, but this project could become your dissertation.
Exxon was so serious about its Bell Labs of Energy dream, it even poached Bell Labs executive research director, Ed David, to run its research arm, the Exxon Research and Engineering Company. And at one point, it planned to open a massive research campus in Clinton, New Jersey.
Exxon was developing this really big center for research. It was going to be like a Bell Labs campus. Okay, it was a beautiful facility, and everybody was designing what they wanted in terms of their new laboratories. And I actually designed a laboratory for the tanker project.
Garvey lucked out and got put on one of the company's most exciting experiments, what they called the tanker project. At the time, there was decades worth of data about CO2 emissions collected from the poles and from atop Mauna Loa on the Big Island of Hawaii. That data had formed the basis of scientist Charles Keeling's work in the 1960s, in which he was able to show a steady curve upward as humans began to burn more and more fossil fuels. Scientists today refer to it as the Keeling curve. But the scientific community had questions around how CO2 was behaving elsewhere on the planet, particularly around the equator and in the oceans.
At the time, there have been lots of measurements at the poles, in the North Atlantic and the Antarctic, showing that, the water gets really cold and it really can suck CO2 out of the atmosphere. That's where all the CO2 is being absorbed. But the other part of the equation is, okay, how much comes out of the equator? So we did this with the Atlantic, with the SO Atlantic, measuring the CO2 release from the oceans.
So Exxon was footing the bill for multiple scientists and for a wide range of cutting-edge equipment. Garvey and Shaw started out using equipment from the Lamont Doherty lab at Columbia University. Lamont Doherty was a leading-edge atmospheric research lab that the Exxon team worked closely with. The machine was picking up too much noise from the ship, so Garvey and Shaw designed a gas chromatograph to do the job, modeled after a machine Ray Weiss had developed at Scripps Institute. The device took about 10 readings per hour of the CO2 in both the air and the ocean as the tanker sailed the Atlantic and crossed the equator.
That was going to be Exxon's contribution, was at least to understand the Atlantic, and maybe we'd go on and do other oceans, hopefully.
What's very clear in speaking with Garvey and various other scientists, both those working at Exxon at the time and those conducting climate science elsewhere, is that any uncertainty that existed at the time was not over whether climate change was happening or whether humans were contributing to it.
The issue was not, were we going to have a problem? The issue was simply, how soon and how fast and how bad was it going to be? Not if. Nobody at Exxon, when I was there, was discussing that. It was just, okay, how fast is it going to come? Can we do something about it? How bad is it going to be? And when is it going to get here? But not if.
That sentiment was echoed by Marty Hofert, a longtime climate scientist who worked at NYU and consulted for Exxon from the late 70s until 2000.
By this time, we had a lot of data that the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was increasing. And even though the temperature of the Earth hadn't increased yet, we had the various mathematical models, very advanced computer models, from which we could sort of figure out how the climate of the Earth might change in some future time if we kept burning hydrocarbons for energy.
It's hard to imagine today, but scientists and companies were not at odds on the issue of climate science in the 1970s, and neither were Republicans and Democrats.
We knew that this had potential impact on the bottom line of Exxon and that it could affect, geopolitics. But that was an abstraction. We were more interested in alternative sources of energy that would, for example, very practically speaking, allow a middle-class American lifestyle, North American lifestyle, to continue without burning fossil fuel.
If you were a child of the 90s, it might be difficult to reconcile this 1970s version of Exxon with the company that would shrug off the Valdez oil spill just 10 years later. But the tanker project was just one of several ways that Exxon was working not only to understand climate change, but also to transition to a new energy future in which it wanted to ensure it had a key role. Here's Ed Garvey again.
Exxon saw this as, if we can get Columbia to work with us, if we can make contributions to the real contributions to the science, then people are going to take us seriously when we tell them these are problems or these are limitations to how you might limit fossil fuel consumption and what the ramifications would be. I do think that, Exxon at the time, there was Exxon Nuclear, there was Exxon Coal, there was Exxon Solar, and at the time, Exxon was trying to be an energy company, not an oil company. Okay, and so being taken seriously at the fossil fuel discussions was to their mind, and I think it made sense to me at the time that, yeah, this is how you would do it if you want to be seen as not just being an industry hack that says we don't want you to regulate our industry, period. You need to be saying, well, yeah, we recognize that this is a problem and this is how we think you should solve it, and these are the things that are going on, and so on and so forth. And we're making real contributions here.
Hofert, too, believed there would be a transition in the 80s.
And so I think what happened is they started to realize that this can actually affect our business. I was very naive. I thought that if they realized that climate change was real, they would start making big investments in renewable energy. It's a huge company. They had a huge amount of profits. Why couldn't they sink some of their profits into a new area, which was going to be new business?
Had they continued down that path, we'd be living in a very different world, looking at a very different future. Next time on Drilled.
It seems to me that the fundamental thing that underlies it is this change in what I call the political power within the corporation. They became much more conservative, much more concerned with the business, the traditional lines of business, and automatically much more focused on preserving that.
I think what happened is they started to realize that this can actually affect our business.
It went from a really heady time to a really time of despair, where the company was shrinking, oil revenue was shrinking, and the Bell Labs idea went out the window.
Drilled is produced and distributed by Critical Frequency. The series was reported by me, Amy Westervelt. Our producer and composer is David Whited. Richard Wiles is our executive producer. Our story and concept development consultant is Reka Murthy. Lucas Lisakowski designed our cover art. Katie Ross, Michael Ann Petrella, and Julia Ritchie provided additional editing. Drilled is supported in part by a generous grant from the Institute for Governance and Sustainable Development. You can find Drilled wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to rate and review the podcast. It helps us find listeners. Thanks for listening. I want to tell you about another podcast that I've started on climate change, co-hosted by Mary Anais Heglar. It's called Hot Take. And every episode, we look at what's happening with climate coverage and how the story is being shaped, who's shaping it, what trends are emerging, and what that means for actually acting on climate. In the first few episodes, we did a massive look back at how climate storytelling has evolved from 2016 to the present. And starting at the end of this month, we're going current and doing an episode every other week that looks at ongoing climate coverage and how the story is emerging today. You can subscribe to Hot Take anywhere you get your podcasts. Check it out.